Yo, what's up guys? It's the new sensation, Big O Notation here, and today I'm going to be bringing you an updated Lord Slug mill deck profile, which I profiled quite a while ago, and I figured that I'd bring you an update to my list because I've switched around a couple of the ratios, I've added in some new cards, and it's been a deck that I've been really enjoying recently, so I just figured I would profile it for you guys so that you guys could see how I've been playing it much more recently. Another reason that I want to be profiling this deck is I'm actually going to be entering an event tomorrow called Fight Night. This is going to be the 4th edition of the Fight Night series. I'll be in Fight Night 4. It's hosted over on Kaioken Cards, so go check out his YouTube channel and stuff. I'll have links in the description. He's got like trailers for all of the Fight Nights. And it's going to be hosted over on his Twitch as well, so I'll have links to that in the description as well. But I'm planning currently to bring this deck along with a couple of other much more fun decks. I'm not going to be bringing anything like meta, anything top tier, because I kind of just want to bring something more fun so that I can have a good time whilst I'm there, because it's a free to play event and the idea is you play a best of 3 match and you bring a different event to a different deck to each game. So it's not just you bring like one top tier deck and you get to stomp everything. You have to bring 3 different decks that you think you're going to be good with, and that's what I'm planning to do. I'm planning to bring 3 fun decks that I really enjoy, that I'm quite comfortable with, and this will probably be one of them. So if any of you are interested in that, it's going to be hosted tomorrow. I think it's the 24th of July tomorrow. And I think it starts at 6:30 Eastern Standard Time, so because I'm in the UK it's going to be a lot later for me. It's going to start like 11 or 12 at night, but I will still be staying up to play some good cards, have a good time, and definitely come check it out. I'll have all the links in the description, so if you're seeing this before then and you feel like checking it out and maybe watching my games, watching some other people's games, definitely check out the Twitch down below, Kaioken Cards. And I'll get into the deck profile. First of all, before you play this deck, I would definitely recommend having some sort of tokens with you. I've got meta tokens, which is appropriate because they're the ones that you summon all the time. But any kind of tokens will do. You bring out a lot of tokens, and also it's also quite important to bring along some dice just to keep track of how many cards your opponent can put back at the end of each turn. But if you guys have seen my other deck profile for this deck, then you probably know a little bit about how the deck works, so I'm going to try not to over-explain things as much as I did last time. But we have the leader. When he swings, you both draw a card, and he has 2 awakening conditions. One is just if you're at 4 or less life, you both draw a card and you untap 2 energy. And then the other condition is if you activate a rejuvenate skill whilst you have 3 or more energy, you can just draw 2 and awaken, which is really nice. Sometimes you just need the flexibility to get to your backside, especially against aggro decks, and you have a couple of ways to take your own life, so you can make use of the untap 2, but if you can't take your own life down to 4 or less, then sometimes you just rejuvenate and then flip over, and that's especially helpful against aggro decks because you get the extra life and the extra cards. On the backside is 20k, but if your opponent has 7 or fewer cards in their hand on their turn, then he gains minus 5k. And when he attacks, you both still draw a card. This deck is primarily a mill deck, and you mill your opponent out by having them draw a bunch of cards, so you kind of want your opponent to be drawing cards, which is why this leader makes both of you draw a card. And then he has a once per turn activate main, where if your opponent has 10 or more cards in hand, you play a Slug's army from your drop area with energy cost 2 or less. So that's really, really strong, just being able to free play out a guy every turn. Really amazing, and you have a lot of targets in this deck. This deck has a lot of free play effects for very, very cheap or completely free, which gives you a lot of advantage. So the Unison for the deck is, I have 4 of the King Piccolo Unison. So this guy has Rejuvenate for 4 markers. You just remove a card underneath it, Rejuvenate for 4 markers. He has an Activate main where he can play himself for 1 energy with 1 marker on him if your opponent has 7 or more cards in hand, but then you can't play any other Unisons for the turn. So you have to be careful. If you're looking to try and kill them by playing down a bunch of Unisons, then you have to pay the full cost for this, at least until the last Unison that you play. But he's 2 cost specified. Oftentimes I do find myself just playing him for 2 energy because I want the extra marker, and this deck doesn't need all of its energy most turns. but oftentimes you can hold energy defensively because it's a stall deck, you want to mill your opponent out. And then the Unison has a +1 where you place a card from your hand under this card, so that fuels your rejuvenate. Then both you and your opponent draw a card, and then you free play a green battle card with an original energy cost of 1 from your hand. And this is a soft draw or soft mill. I'll probably be using the terms soft mill or soft draw and hard draw, which means hard mill or hard draw is just your opponent straight up draws a card, but the soft mill or soft draw is where your opponent has the opportunity to put that card back into the deck or back at the bottom of the deck at the end of the turn. So your leader is a hard mill or hard draw. This Unison is a soft mill or a soft draw. So that's very important to note, and that's why it's important to have some dice with you when you're playing this deck. I've got like 4 dice next to me for when I play this deck, because it's very important to keep track of how many cards your opponent can put back at the end of each turn. So for my 1-drops, which you can free play off the Unison, I have 4 of this Lord Slug. This is kind of the main centerpiece of the deck. You want to be seeing this card every single game if you can. He's unique. He has an auto. When he's played, you both draw a card, but it's a soft mill, so your opponent can put it back at the end of the turn. And then he has an activate main where if your opponent has 7 or more cards in hand, you can free play a Slug's Army card with 19k power or less from your hand. And then it has limit 1 text, but this was made before the limit 1 keyword came out, so it just says you can't activate copies of the activate main on copies of this card for the turn. So this is the main centerpiece of the deck because it just gets, once per turn you can free play anything from your hand basically. Really strong, and he starts soft milling your opponent, and oftentimes your opponent doesn't realize that they're going to be milled out for a little while with this deck, so they keep a lot of cards in their hand rather than putting them back, and then suddenly they'll be on like 10 cards left in deck and they'll realize that they have to start putting guys back. So that's really good, especially in the early game. That happens quite a lot. So for another 1-drop, we have 4 of the Surprise Attack Anguilla. This card is really simple. Just when it's played from hand, you look at the top 5 cards of your deck, and then you add a Slug's Army with energy cost 3 or less, or a King Piccolo Unison, or Green Unison specified cost of 2, so the King Piccolo one. This is just really nice if you don't see your Lord Slug, or if you already have it out on the board because it has unique. Then you can free play this from the Unison, or you can just tap 1 to play it, because oftentimes you have an abundance of energy. Even on like turn 2 you have too much energy because you don't use it all in the end. So this is just a great way to get your advantage going. Search your deck in case you don't see your Lord Slug or your Unison, and if you do already have them and you have them out on board, you can just free play this for extra searches. Really nice. Something that's important to note with these 2 cards is they only get their effects when played from hand. The Lord Slug can still use its activate main, but you don't both draw a card if it's played from somewhere else other than the hand. So if you're playing them off of your leader's activate main, you actually don't get their effects, which is really important to note. But we have some good targets for the activate main coming up later. And then for the final 1-drop that I'm running, I have 3 of a new card from set 13, which is Wings supporting the Master's Wish. This card is really strong. I really underestimated this card when I first saw it, and for a while I didn't even know it was in the set. But it's a 1-drop unique blocker. It has a permanent of when activating the Rejuvenate skill on one of your Unisons. If your leader is Slug's Army and your opponent has 7 or more cards in hand, you reduce the number of markers required by 1. Which is really strong because it means that oftentimes if your Unison is on even just 1 or 2 markers, you can actually activate Rejuvenate, because you can activate the +1 to gain a marker, stick another copy of the Unison underneath, and then play the Wings down so that you only need 3 markers to rejuvenate with, and then that will allow you to trigger your leader's alternative awakening condition if you have 3 or more energy, that is. So this is really strong. The only reason I'm not running 4 copies of it is because it has unique, so you can only have 1 out at a time. And then the other effect that it has is when this card activates its blocker skill, you and your opponent draw a card, and this is a hard mill, which is really nice for the deck. Just having more blockers in a stall deck is really nice, and being able to activate Rejuvenate cheaper is amazing as well, both for your alternative awakening and just in case you need that extra life. So that's it for the 1-drops. Now for cards to free play off of the 1-drop Lord Slug. Our first card is Lord Slug Return to Life. We have 4 copies of this. He's 3-drop 19k, so he can be free played. And he's very simple. He has an auto of if all of your energy is mono green, when it's played from your hand, you and your opponent draw a card. This is a soft mill, and then you get to KO one of your opponent's battle cards. It doesn't go through barrier, but it has no other restrictions, which is really, really nice. So it's just some really strong removal, and that's why we're running 4 copies. It doesn't have unique or anything. And then the next target for our free plays going to be 4 Lord Slug, Thwarter of Plans. So this card is 15k power and deflect, and then it has an auto for bond 2. When your opponent combos, it's basically like the Bardock Unison, where it kills the combo, and then you and your opponent both draw a card, but it negates the skill for the turn. This is a hard mill, so your opponent doesn't get to put it back, which is great. And then when it's removed from the battle area or KO'd, if your opponent has 7 or more cards in hand, you get to free play a 1-drop from your drop area, which is great. The main target for this is going to be the Wings or the Lord Slug if you don't already have the Lord Slug out. Generally what happens is your opponent might activate like a board clear and just clear out all of your guys, and then this 3-drop will revive the 1-drop from your drop area so that you can keep free playing cards next turn, which is great. The main utility of this card is just being able to threaten your opponent with mills if they combo. So it means if you're playing against a deck that uses arrivals like Red Green King Vegeta, this card comes in really clutch, especially if with that specific deck, because it can kill off the Nappa and mean that it doesn't revive. Or if you're playing against King Piccolo, this card comes in really clutch. Just any deck that uses any sort of comboing, this card is amazing. And even if your opponent doesn't combo all that much, or comboing isn't like a main usage of the deck, like game plan, way to free play guys, this card is still really strong because it means you can start threatening your opponent's life down, and either they have to take a bunch of life and that can put them into kill range oftentimes, or they have to combo out and threaten being milled a bit more. So this card is really good, and the fact that he doesn't have unique is amazing because you can play multiple copies of him down and then start killing your opponent's combos off more and more. And every time you use this effect, it's effectively a +1 for you, and your opponent mills a card, which is really, really strong. And then for our last main target of the 1-drop Lord Slug, we have 3 Anguilla. This card is mostly good in the early game. It's a 3-drop 19k, and all it does is when it comes into play, at the end of the turn, if you have 6 or fewer cards in your hand and your opponent has 10 or more, then you draw 3 cards. So this is mainly used in the early game on like turn 2, maybe turn 3 sometimes. If your opponent if you can just fill up your opponent's hand and then you don't have all that many cards in your hand, you can just drop this guy and you draw 3, which is really, really strong, obviously. Sometimes it comes up later in the game if you're in a simplified game state where you don't have that many cards in hand and you're able to fill up your opponents again. This card can come in nicely, but most of the time it's just used in the early game as a nice draw 3 at the start. So that's most of the free play guys. I have a couple more, but they're not as usually as good. We have 3 Lord Slug Return to Form. He's 2-drop 10k, so he can be free played off of the 1-drop Lord Slug, which can come up sometimes, but most of the time you don't need to do it because you want to free play the 3-drops if possible. But because he's a 2-drop, you can also play him off your Lord Slug Leader Activate main. And he's very simple. It's just when he comes into play, you search your deck for a 4 or less Slugs army and then add it to your hand. So sometimes you even hardcast this guy just for 2 energy. If you have your 1-drop out, you can hardcast this guy for 2 energy to search one of your 3-drops and then free play a 3-drop with your 1-drop. So that's a really nice combo. And then obviously this is going to be your main target for your Leaders Activate main, because you want to be bringing this guy back every turn. He's a 10k beater if your opponent's leader is quite weak or if you need to kill a Unison, and he just searches a card, which is amazing. Something else that's quite important to note about this deck is that it's actually 60 cards, so that's kind of like your main condition for winning the game, is obviously milling your opponent out, but because you're both drawing cards when you're milling them, it's important that you run 60 card deck, because otherwise you would mill yourself out first. Especially because your opponent actually has the opportunity to put some of their mills back into their deck. Running 60 cards is really important for this deck because it just gives you 10 cards deeper that you can go into your deck before you mill out. For the last kind of free play guy of the deck, I have 3 Zayun the Loyal. I think I was running this at 4 last time, but the Wings blocker has replaced one of the copies. The Wings blocker is most of the time better than this card, but because it has unique, I can't run 4 of it without it bricking quite a few times. But this is just a free blocker. If your leader is a Lord Slug, then you get to play this guy without paying the energy cost. That's all it really does. It's nice in this deck because you want to be stalling out the game, and it synergizes really nicely with Dormant, and you can also free play it off of your leader backside effect, which comes in really, really clutch a lot of the time. If you just need to survive one more turn, you just play a bunch of blockers and basically pray. Another thing that's important to note is this Wings and all of your 1-drops are free playable off of your leader backside effect, but the Wings out of all of the 1-drops is going to be your main target because it offers the most utility, because it's a blocker, it can hard mill your opponent, it can draw you a card, and it can soften the blow of your rejuvenate. So for the last of the Slug's army cards, I'm running 4 Meta Marcher. This card is so insane, like it's so strong for the deck. It's just like a Saiyan Instincts but on crack, basically. This card is really, really good. So you tap 1 green for its activate main, and you send it from your drop area to your warp. Then you can choose to add up to 1 card from your life to your hand. You play a meta token, which is a 5k 0 cost combo power, 5k combo power. So that's just some extra combo power most of the time, which is great. So you play one of those, and then you draw 2 cards, and your opponent draws 2 cards. The only downside to this is a soft mill for your opponent, so it doesn't just force your opponent to keep the 2 cards. But you're still drawing 2 cards. If your opponent is putting 2 cards back, they effectively didn't draw at all, so they didn't gain any advantage from this, and you just gained a token, 2 cards, and potentially a life, which is insanely good value for 1 energy. So it's cheaper than Saiyan Instincts, and it effectively does more for the deck than Saiyan Instincts would anyway. This card's just really, really, really insane for the deck. It does have the limit 1 skill where you can only activate 1 of the skills on copies of the card for the turn. So that's important to note, but you want to be, if you can, using 1 of these every single turn. And the fact that it can take a life as well is really important, because oftentimes, especially against aggro decks, if I'm left on 5 life on like turn 2 or turn 3, I will trigger this guy in the drop area to take a life so that I can take myself down to 4 life and gain some cards in my hand, and then I want to awaken so that I can start gaining advantage off of the awaken skill because I'll untap 2, and so I gain a bit of tempo, and I want to be taking advantage of my activate main skill on the backside to gain some searches as well. So that's really, really strong against aggro, just being able to take your life down to 4. If you're really close to 4 but you can't quite awaken, then this is really nice against aggro. But most of the time this is going to be it's just amazing. It's good against control as well because it mills them further potentially, but it also gives you more cards, and it can help you self-awaken. It's just all round one of the best cards in the deck for sure. Obviously we're running a green deck, we have Unisons, and it's a stall deck, so we want to be running 4 Dormants, and to pair with the 4 Dormants we have 4 Freezer. This just kind of standard for any green deck. Dormant is especially good in this deck because you have inevitability with this deck, similar to Invoker. Well, what Invoker used to be before the catastrophic blow nerf. You have inevitability in the deck. You're guaranteed to win the longer the game goes on, because you're a mill strategy, so the longer the game goes on, the better position you're going to be in. So Dormant Potential is just good for stalling out the game. To assimilate, because this is a 60 card deck and I want to be seeing my 1-drop Lord Slug as often as possible, turn 1, turn 2, you want to be looking for this card. Just any turn you don't have this card, you want it. It's the best card it's one of the best cards in the deck because it starts all of your free plays. And this can search the 1-drop, so this effectively means I have 6 copies of the 1-drop, along with 4 Surprise Attack Anguilla, which will search out the 1-drop as well. This card is just great, and it can also search out your 2-drop, the Returned to Form. So if you already have an abundance of 1-drops, you can use this to search out the 2-drop, and then that's a way to get him in the drop area to start triggering your backside activate main a bunch and gaining a bunch of advantage that way. Now, I'm also running 3 copies of Bigger More. So the Roshi nerf, where Roshi got banned, was a really big hit for this deck. I didn't really play the deck around the time that Roshi was still legal, but I know that from seeing other people play the deck, Roshi was really, really strong in this deck because you could obviously recycle Dormant, and Dormant is really, really good in this deck, being able to stall out the game. I figured a good replacement, at least for now, is going to be Bigger More, especially in this meta when we have like Dark Broly running around, we have Mecha Frieza summon some big guys, we have Sin Shenron aggro running around, we have all of these decks that just free play out big guys. Bigger More is going to come in really, really nicely against most decks, and if it isn't very good in a certain matchup, you can always just charge it, which is fine. This deck really struggles for cards to charge, especially in the early game, because you need a lot of combo pieces in your hand, because you'll often need like Unison plus 1-drop plus 3-drop plus like some searchers or something. So that's already 4 cards out of your 6-card starting hand that you need to keep. So this deck really, really struggles with early charges. So if this card is dead in a matchup, you just charge it, which is fine. But this card is really, really good. Like, I really underestimated how good this card was. I was originally running like 2 copies, and then because it was a 60-card deck, I just found I wasn't seeing the card enough, and I upped it to 3. And since then, it's just come in really clutch. Often a play that I like making, especially against Sin Shenron aggro, is oftentimes if you're left on 5 life by turn 2, you use the 1-drop Meta Marcher to take yourself down to 4 so that you have the untapped 2 available to you. You then pay the 1 energy to play down your Unison, play down your 1-drop, and then play down a 3-drop to start free playing and drawing a bunch of cards. And then you awaken, untap 2, draw 1, play Bigger More for 2 energy so that your opponent can't really do much the next turn. This is, I think I mentioned before, but this is especially good against Sin aggro, this play in particular. And then you can use the activate main to start gaining advantage that way. And from then on, your opponent really can't play the game. That play is also really, really good against Dark Broly. I haven't tested this deck against Dark Broly much, but in theory that would be amazing. So as far as hard negates, we have 2 copies of Sacrifice and 2 copies of the new Homicidal Clones. I'm really, really back and forth between these 2 cards. Sacrifice is obviously amazing because it costs 1 less, so you don't necessarily have to take a life, whereas with Homicidal Clones, oftentimes, just because of the fact that it costs 2 energy, means that you're going to have to be taking some life when you want to be playing it. But then Homicidal Clones can stop up to 2 attacks, whereas Sacrifice can only stop 1. But Sacrifice is a lot better in the early game because it can defend your Unison a lot easier because it doesn't require you to be on 5 or less life. So I've gone very back and forth between these cards. Originally I was running 4 Homicidal Clones, then I had like 1 Sacrifice in the deck, and then I decided to cut down on Homicidal Clones, run another Sacrifice, and I'm kind of considering running more Sacrifices at the moment, but I'm really, really back and forth between them. Some days I love Sacrifice and some days I love Homicidal Clones. I think it really depends on the matchup a lot of the time. But those are all of the hard negates we have. Then for a couple of tech choices in the deck, I've got 2 Vegeta Resolute Agent of Destruction. This was in my last version of the deck as well. I think this card is really, really good in the deck. One of the main reasons is people just don't expect it in a mill deck. Just being able to tap 4 and clear out a board, ignoring barrier, is really strong. And this deck really struggles with barrier removal because none of the other removal in the deck goes through barrier. So this can just be really nice if you're playing against a deck like TN, which runs a lot of barrier guys that they need to stick on board, or like Announcer as well, or even against King Piccolo before the drum nerf, you would be able to just clear out a board of drums and start swinging as well. And this also offers just another threat because they don't want you to get to 5 markers and rip 3 cards out of their hand. So I think this is just the best board clear for the deck because it's one of the only ones that comes down on 4 energy and goes through everything and offers a threat afterwards. So I just think it's really strong. And also something that's really good about this card is that it means that you can activate Rejuvenate on your King Piccolo Unison on turn 4, gain an extra life, and then tap 4 for this guy, board clear, and you're still able to keep your Dormant Potentials and Frieza Charismatics alive, which is really, really nice. And then for Secret Rare, I'm running 1 Black Smoke. I think before I was running Salzino. The Salzino nerf really doesn't hurt this deck because oftentimes you were dropping your Salzino on turn 5 anyway, so I think that Salzino is still a fine Secret Rare to run. I just think that Black Smoke being able to warp the top 7 cards of your opponent's deck on turn 5 is really, really good, and it kind of gives you a lot better of a finisher in terms of mill game plan, because oftentimes when your opponent gets low on deck size, they start putting a lot more cards back, and it makes it a lot trickier for this deck to actually end the game through mill. So I found this card was just really good to solidify an end game win condition for mill. Salzino is still great because it offers that big quad strike dual attack threat, and it rips 3 cards out of the hand. And if you have the combo killer on the board, the Thwarter of Plans, then it can force your opponent to start comboing, which is great. But I just found Black Smoke was really nicely flexible in the ability that you could warp top 7 of your opponent's deck. You can also clear the board through barrier, which is great, and you can also rip cards out of your opponent's hand. So I just found that it was kind of a little bit more flexible than Salzino was in testing, and it's also cheaper, so for any budget players out there, this is definitely going to be a better alternative. I think that the secret rare choice in this deck is really, really flexible. I think you can run like Heroine's Lineage, you can run the Great Ape SCR, you can run Salzino, you can run Black Smoke, you can run kind of anything you really want to in this deck. You don't even need a secret rare as well if you don't want to. And then for final cards of the deck, you just have 4 super combos. I'm going with 2 Giro and 2 Paragus at the moment. I generally really don't like 2-2 splits on super combos, I just find them quite inconsistent. And I find that with most decks, one super combo is just better than the other. But I think with this deck it's appropriate because 2 Giro effectively means you're running 6 copies of Meta Marcher, because you can ditch Meta Marcher with Giro, and that's almost always going to be your target. Your only other targets in the deck sometimes is if you don't have a target to revive off of your leader effect and you want a specific card in the drop to revive. That's the only time that I'll ever ditch something other than Meta Marcher or Giro. I think that 4 Giro in this deck is really, really incorrect unless you're running a lot more drop area effects, like maybe you're running Great Ape or something. Or if you're running some sort of green-yellow arrival package, like I know there's an Android 13 that can arrival in that can pop 2 guys at the start of every turn, and that card also has a drop area effect where he can warp himself and pop a 3-drop or something. So 4 Giro, if you're running that Android 13, makes a bit more sense because it has a drop area effect and it gives you access to arrival plays, which is nice. But I'm not a huge fan of it. I think that the Android 13 is a little bit inconsistent, and it also offers you another dead card in your deck, where if you draw into it, you don't have Giro, it's going to be dead. And in a 60 card deck, that's really, really that's really reliably going to happen quite a lot, where you draw into the Android 13 and you don't have Giro. But also it's the fact that you then can't charge the Android 13 because your deck, most of the effects require you to have all mono green energy, and also just charging an energy exhaust in your energy at any point is just going to be a loss of tempo, which is really, really frustrating for this deck, because it has a lot of 1-drop, so it can always use up all of its energy if it needs to. So I think 2 Paragus, 2 Giro is fine, and Paragus comes in really nicely if you're trying to end the game through killing them, or if you're needing to defend against some aggro decks. So that's the entire deck. I hope you guys enjoyed the deck profile. Definitely check out the fight night tomorrow at 6:30 EST or 11:30 or like 12 at midnight for anyone in the UK that might be watching. Definitely give this deck a try. It requires a lot of really good sequencing, I found. I also find that in every single game that I play, even if I manage to win the game, I find that I could have played it better a little bit earlier. Like somewhere down the line, I feel like I always misplay with this deck just because it's so complex and there's so many different plays that you can make every single turn. But it's a really, really fun deck. I definitely recommend you give it a try. It can definitely take down some of the top contenders. I remember in testing, I was playing against my friend Johnny, aka Turn to Stone, and he was playing King Vegeta, and I hadn't played against King Vegeta before, but so game 1 he absolutely destroyed me and killed me turn 2. and then game 2 I managed to kind of understand how his deck worked a little bit better, and I managed to get him to a 27 card hand, and he just couldn't kill me because I had like dormant every single turn, and I was just able to stall out the game and mill him out. But that was a really fun game, and you get a lot of games like that where your opponent has like 27 cards in hand and they just can't kill you. So if you're looking for some cheesy gameplay like that, and if you're looking to maybe piss some people off with how long your turns take, I definitely recommend giving this deck a try. It's a lot of fun. Check out the Fight Night and all of that good stuff. Like